The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the sort of day that had no business changing a life. Cecily Vane read it twice at the kitchen table, once for the words and once for what the words meant, and then she folded it along its crease with the care of a woman folding something she would have to unfold again very soon. Her sister Harriet was to be married in 6 weeks. That was the first fact. The second fact, buried in the third paragraph in their uncle's looping hand, was that Harriet did not wish to be married. The third fact, the one that arrived last and sat heaviest, was that the man who had arranged the match, who held their uncle's debts, who held therefore their uncle, and by extension Harriet, and by extension all of them, was the Duke of Ashvale. And the Duke, their uncle wrote, would hear no argument from any man in the county. He had tried. He had asked 3 of his acquaintances to try. The matter was settled. Cecily was to do nothing. She had tucked the letter into her apron and gone back to auditing the household accounts, because that was what there was to do. And then she had thought about Harriet's face at Christmas and had reached for her coat. She did not yet know what walking through that gate would cost her. Had she known, she would have walked faster. The village of Thornwick lay 2 miles behind her, and Ashvale Park lay a mile ahead, and it was the kind of late August morning that pressed down like a warm hand. The air thick and still and smelling of turned earth, and something sweet she could not name. She was not afraid, precisely. Fear was the sensation you felt when the outcome was uncertain, and Cecily had decided the outcome before she left the house. She would speak to the Duke. She would lay the case plainly. If he was a reasonable man, she would find a reasonable argument. If he was not a reasonable man, she would find a different kind of argument, because in her experience, every person, no matter how unreasonable, had a price, and prices were her profession. She had kept accounts for the Holloway household for 4 years, and before that for her father's small practice, and before that she had simply known, in the way a child knows a truth before they know its name, that everything balanced in the end, and the trick was finding out against what. The gates of Ashvale were open. That seemed significant, though she could not have said why. She walked up the gravel drive with her chin level and her hands still at her sides, which was her strategy for every difficult room she had ever entered. Give nothing away before you know what it costs, and she was perhaps 50 yards from the front door when she heard the voices. A window stood open on the ground floor. The voices came through it the way voices do when people have forgotten a window is open, freely, without performance. She'll cry. This voice was female, smooth, lightly bored. She won't. A man's voice, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that expected to be heard without raising itself. All of them cry. Eventually, the uncle certainly did. The uncle had something to cry about. The sister, from what I am told, has rather more backbone than the uncle. A pause. She'll argue. And you will listen? I will hear her. That is not the same thing. Cecily stopped walking. She was aware that she was doing the thing she had just decided she would not do, which was give something away before she knew what it cost, and yet she stood in the gravel drive and absorbed this intelligence with a kind of professional attention, the way she filed a discrepancy in a column, noticed, noted, not yet understood. He expected her to argue. He expected the argument to fail. He had already decided. The question was what he had decided about, and whether there was a seam in it wide enough to get a hand into. She smoothed her coat, finished the 50 yards, and knocked. The butler who opened the door had the face of a man who had been asked, over the course of a long career, to produce expressions of polite neutrality about increasingly extraordinary things. He was very good at it. He looked at Cecily, plain coat, no card, no footman, no carriage, a light film of gravel dust on her boots, and his face did not change by so much as a degree. Miss Vane, she said, to see His Grace. He is expecting me. He was, as it turned out, expecting her in a library the size of a modest church, with windows along one side that let in the heavy morning light in long, pale rectangles. He was standing when she entered, which surprised her. Men who held all the cards generally sat. He was tall, with the kind of stillness she associated with men who had spent time in difficult places and learned that stillness was the most economical way to move through the world. His hands, and this she noted because it was anomalous, were not the hands of a man who had only ever held a title. There was a scar along the base of the right thumb, faded to white. The kind you got from work done with tools. He was perhaps 35. He had the face of a man who had had one very large grief and had subsequently arranged his features around it permanently. He did not smile. His eyes went over her once, the way hers had gone over the window, and she thought, he is also noting things. Good, that was an equal footing. Miss Vane. Not a question. Your Grace. She did not curtsy any deeper than courtesy required. I am here about my sister. Yes, he gestured to a chair. Sit, if you like. I will stand. Thank you. The faintest thing moved through his eyes. Not amusement, precisely. Recognition of something, perhaps. He remained standing also. Then we will both stand. I find it marginally more honest. I find it marginally more comfortable to be at the same elevation as the person I am negotiating with, she said. Since we are being candid about our reasons. The thing in his eyes happened again. Very well. State your case. My sister is 22. She has been promised, without her consent, to a match arranged between her guardian and your agent. She does not wish to marry the man in question. I am told you hold the instrument of this arrangement and that you will not release it. I am asking you to release it. On what grounds? On the grounds that she does not want it. He waited. She understood that he was waiting for the argument she was supposed to make, the appeal to sentiment, or to her uncle's straitened circumstances, or to some moral framework she might dress up in enough language to suggest that his releasing the contract would be to his advantage in some material way. She had prepared several such arguments. She looked at him and decided to set them all aside. Is that the whole of your case? It is the whole of my case. My sister does not want it. You hold it. I am asking you to let it go. Most people, he said, would say something about the nature of the young man, his character, his circumstances. They would say something about her youth, her sensibility. They would apply to my better nature. I don't know your better nature. I have been in this room 3 minutes, and I have your word that you will hear me, which is not the same as your word that you will listen. Applying to a nature I have not observed would be speculation, and I find speculation expensive. Expensive. It costs more than it yields, in my experience. He was quiet. There was something in the quality of the quiet that was not displeasure. She could not name it more precisely than that. What is your profession, Miss Vane? I keep accounts. For whom? Currently for Mrs. Holloway at Thornwick, previously for my father. Before that, for anyone who asked and could not find the error themselves. I am good at it. I don't doubt it. He turned toward the window, not away from her, she noted, at an angle so he could still see her in his periphery. I did not arrange this match to cause your sister suffering. I will confess that to you, since we are being candid. The original purpose was entirely other. What purpose? One I am not presently at liberty to lay before you. The words came out with precision, like a clerk reading a formal notice. There is a thing I cannot yet explain. I am asking you to trust that it exists. That is a considerable thing to ask of a person who has been in your library 4 minutes. I am aware. He looked at her. Something in his face was very still, in the manner of a man taking a blow, without letting his face report it. I will tell you this. The young man in question will not marry your sister. You have my word. Your word is not a legal instrument. No, but my name on a document is, and you will have that before you leave this house. He crossed to the desk, unhurried, economical, not a movement wasted, and pulled a sheet from the drawer. I will release the contract. Your sister will not be bound. Write to her tonight. Cecily watched him. She had expected argument, deflection, a counteroffer priced higher than she could pay. She had not expected this. She was experienced enough with ledgers to know that when a column resolved this cleanly, when a number simply presented itself without resistance, something in the accounting had been done elsewhere, out of sight. Why? She said. He looked up from the desk. Because you asked plainly, and because, a pause, precise and deliberate, I have been looking for a reason to let it go. She filed that under, not yet understood. She left Asheville with the document in her coat pocket and a sensation she could not account for, which was the feeling of having won a thing she had not been entirely trying to win. The woman's name was Mrs. Revel, and she had been the Duke's cousin by marriage for 11 years, which was 9 years longer than the first Duchess of Asheville had been alive to be married to him. She wore everything soft and said everything softly, and had a quality of making every room feel slightly smaller in her vicinity, though Cecily could not initially have said precisely why. She arrived at the park 3 days after Cecily's visit, in a carriage so clean it seemed offensive, and she brought with her 2 pieces of information that circulated the village within 24 hours. First, that she was looking after the Duke's household affairs while he remained in mourning for his late steward, and second, that Miss Vane had been retained by His Grace to audit the estate accounts. This second piece of information was news to Cecily, who received it by way of a note that arrived the morning after Mrs. Revel's arrival. The note was 4 lines in the Duke's hand. It stated that his previous steward had died 6 weeks ago, that the accounts were in a condition he described as uncertain, that he understood she was competent, and that he would pay her standard rate and not ask her to do anything she did not wish to do. The last clause was unusual enough that she read the note twice. She wrote back that she would come on Thursday. She came on Thursday. The accounts were not uncertain. They were, in her professional assessment, a wreck of a particular kind, not neglected, not confused, but arranged to look worse than they were by someone who had wanted them to look that way. She did not say this immediately. She sat in the small office off the library for 6 hours with the ledgers, and by the 5th hour she had a clear picture of the arrangement, and by the 6th hour she had a clear picture of who had arranged it. She had also developed a headache, and a feeling she was more accustomed to finding in difficult rooms than in ledger columns, which was the feeling of being watched. She looked up. The Duke was in the doorway. He had a cup of something in each hand, which she had not expected, and he looked at the ledgers spread around her and the notes she had made in her careful columns, and said nothing for a moment. "You have found something. I have found several things." She set down her pen. "I would prefer to be certain before I say what they are. There is a thing I cannot yet lay before you. You will have it when I am sure." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully parse. Then he set one of the cups on the corner of the desk nearest her, not too near, a considered distance, and left without speaking. She thought, he understands an explicit promissory note. Good, she picked up the cup. It was strong tea, no sugar, which was exactly what she would have asked for and had not. The ledgers told a story, as ledgers always did, but this one was told in a cipher that had been designed to be unmistakable once you had the key, and completely invisible before. Someone had been withdrawing small amounts from the estate for the better part of 3 years, not so small as to be invisible, but arranged so that each withdrawal could be explained individually. A repair here, a settlement there, a payment to a supplier whose invoices she would not find because the invoices did not exist. She found the first false invoice on the second day. She found 6 more by the end of the first week. By the end of the second week, she had a number. It was not a small number. She had been given a room at the park by then. The Duke had made this offer after she had spent 3 days traveling 2 miles each way and arrived still sharp enough to work until evening. And he had made the offer in exactly the way she would have wanted it made, which was without sentiment, as a matter of efficiency. "You are traveling to work rather than working," he said. "It is an inefficiency." She had accepted on the same terms, and Mrs. Revel had smiled at this arrangement with her mouth and done something else entirely with her eyes, which Cecily filed. In the evenings, she walked the kitchen garden, because the heat of the day required some amendment, and the kitchen garden had the best air. The Duke appeared there on the 3rd evening, which was 2 more evenings than she had expected, and they walked the rows in a silence that was, she found, comfortable in the way that silences between people who are paying attention to the same things are comfortable. He stopped at the base of a rosemary hedge and broke a sprig of it, and turned it in his fingers, which was a habit she had already tracked as his thinking gesture, the motion his hands made when his mind was working. He carried the smell of it back into the house for the rest of the evening. "You lost someone," she said, on the 4th evening. She had not planned to say it. He was quiet for a moment. The hedge was very still. "My wife," he said. "3 years ago. I am sorry." "It was not." He stopped. Then, more carefully, she was not well for some time before. The grief and the marriage were not entirely separable. She understood that she had been given something that had not been given to many people, and she held it accordingly. "My father," she said. 2 years ago, he left the practice to me and no money to run it, and no one who wished to consult a woman on their accounts, and so I came here. To keep Mrs. Holloway's household. To keep Mrs. Holloway's household. A pause. She is a fair employer. But not a permanent position. Nothing is permanent. That is the first thing accounts teach you. She looked at the garden going gray in the evening light. The second is that everything balances, in the end, even if you cannot see against what. He looked at her. She had become, over 4 evenings, a person who could read the quality of his silences with some accuracy, and this one had a different quality from the others. He said nothing. The rosemary sprig had gone still in his hand. "You should be careful," he said at last, walking alone in the evening. "I am always careful. I am also very good at walking alone. I have been doing it some time." "I know." Something in his voice, the faintest change, like a door opened a degree and then caught. He turned back toward the house. "Come in out of the heat, Miss Vane." She followed, and noted, and filed. Mrs. Revel found her in the records room on the 9th day. She came in softly, which was her habit, and she smiled softly, which was also her habit, and she said softly that it must be very tedious work, all of this reading of old columns, and that the Duke was surely grateful, even if he was not always the most expressive of men. Cecily agreed that the work was detailed because it was, and thanked her for the observation because she was polite. Mrs. Revel sat, which Cecily had not invited but did not discourage, and spoke for some minutes about the estate and the late steward, Mrs. Rowe, and her genuine grief at his passing. The man had served the family for 15 years, and Cecily let her speak and watched her hands. Mrs. Revel's hands were very still. This was interesting, because people who spoke of genuine grief usually moved their hands. The accounts will not find anything remarkable, Mrs. Revel said at the pleasant end of a sentence about Autumn. Mr. Rowe was a careful man. I have no doubt he was, Cecily said. Only if you were to find something that looked unusual, it would be worth being certain before troubling his grace. He has had a great deal of trouble this year. He is not a resilient man, for all that he appears otherwise. Cecily looked at her. She looked at her for exactly long enough to watch the smile do its work and to register what lived behind it. I am always certain, she said, before I say anything. Thank you for your concern. Mrs. Revel smiled again and left. Cecily picked up her pen. The feeling she had had in the doorway of the library on the first day, that something in this account had been done elsewhere, out of sight, had located itself. She now knew where to look for the rest. It was the rosemary that did it. Or rather, it was her own nose, which had become accustomed over 4 evenings in the kitchen garden to the scent of the herb, and which, on the 10th morning, caught a trace of it in the corridor outside the records room, and identified it as wrong, too strong, too deliberate, and above all coming from the direction of the door she had left locked. She was not a woman who made assumptions from scent alone, but she was a woman who had been taught by her father to trust what the ledger showed and what the room said at the same time, and the room said that someone had been in it. She checked the ledger she had left on the desk. It was precisely as she had left it. She checked the drawer where she kept her notes. Also, as left, she checked, with great care, the inner pocket of the case where she kept her copies, and found that one page, only one, the summary she had made of the false invoices, rendered in her father's cipher that she still used for rough drafts, was 6 degrees off from where she had placed it. Someone had read it and replaced it, and had been very nearly careful enough. She sat for a long time. Then she made a second copy of everything, in a different cipher, and put it in her boot. She did not tell the Duke. Not yet. There was a thing she could not yet lay before him, and she knew now what it was, a name and a number and a proof, and she did not have the proof. She had the shape of it, which was not the same thing. Harriet came to visit on the 14th day, because their uncle had written her after all that the match was dissolved, and Harriet, who was younger and warmer and moved through the world with a directness that Cecily had always thought both beautiful and expensive, had swept in like weather and embraced Cecily in the entry hall and said, at a volume designed to carry, that Cecily had saved her, that she was the cleverest person alive, that the Duke was apparently a good man after all. Cecily had steered her firmly toward the garden and away from any room in which the Duke might be standing. He was standing in the library. She was almost certain she heard, through the door, the faintest possible exhalation of breath that might, under very specific conditions, have been called a laugh. She filed it under, the first. She had been waiting. In the garden, Harriet produced from her pocket a letter she had received from the young man in question, a Mr. Dalton, who it turned out had also not wished the match, and was deeply relieved and wished Harriet well, and Harriet read it twice with her nose wrinkled and said that he seemed perfectly nice and she could not imagine why on earth anyone had arranged it in the first place. I have some ideas, Cecily said. Harriet looked at her. Harriet had her father's ability to read a face. How long have you had them? Several days. And nothing yet. She folded her hands in her lap. Not yet. Cecily, everything balances in the end, she said. That is the first thing accounts teach you. Harriet was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the directness that was her nature, Do you like him? The garden was very still. Cecily looked at the rosemary hedge, which stood in the corner of the kitchen garden, doing nothing except existing, as hedges do. "He is a fair employer," she said. Harriet said nothing. She was also very good at saying nothing. That evening the Duke found her in the kitchen garden at her usual hour and said, without preamble, "Your sister is forthright." "She is." She informed me, in the course of approximately 4 minutes, that I had been good to you, that she hoped the accounts were nearly finished, and that I should ask you properly before you decided the question for both of us. He paused. "I apologize. She was very direct." Cecily looked at the rosemary. She was mortified in the way you are mortified when someone has said aloud something you have been very carefully not saying. She was also, underneath the mortification, aware of a warmth she could not entirely account for, and she chose to put it away with everything else she was keeping for later. "She has always talked too freely," she said. "Pay her no mind." "I did not say it troubled me," he said. He was looking at the hedge also. His hands were at his sides, very still, in the posture she had come to understand meant something the opposite of stillness, meant something held down, by long practice, with considerable effort. "Miss Vane." "Your Grace." A pause. Then, with precision, "There is a thing I cannot yet say to you. I would ask you to hold it alongside the thing you cannot yet say to me, and see if they balance in the end." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her, directly, without the oblique angles he usually permitted himself, as if he had reached some decision about what economy was, and found that this particular expenditure was worth it. She understood that they were standing at the edge of something neither of them was yet in a position to cross. She understood also that he was telling her the edge was there. "Very well," she said. "I will hold it." He nodded once. They went in, as they always did, in a silence that was by this point comfortable the way that silences between people who have reached an understanding are comfortable, carefully, without disturbing it. The blow came on the morning of the 16th day. She found the letter on her desk. She had not put it there. It was addressed to her in a hand she recognized as her own, or rather as a close copy of it, skilled enough to deceive a person who was not looking, not skilled enough to deceive a person who spent their days with documents. Inside were 3 pages of correspondence apparently between herself and a Mr. Henley, the county solicitor, concerning an arrangement she had allegedly made with him to obscure certain discrepancies in the Ashvale accounts. The arrangement, on paper, looked like a bribe. The discrepancies, on paper, looked like hers. She read all 3 pages twice, once for the words and once for what the words meant, and then she folded them along their creases. She was very still for a moment. The fear had a weight, and the weight was the falseness of her own name at the bottom of the 3rd page, and the understanding of what it would cost her if anyone else read it before she had the proof. She thought of the document in her boot. She thought of the cipher copy she had made. She thought of everything balancing in the end. She opened her desk, put the letter underneath the ledgers, and went to find the Duke. He was not in the library. He was not in the entry hall. He was in the stables, with his sleeves turned back, doing something with an adjusting screw on the back axle of a carriage that had been giving his driver trouble. She stood in the stable door and watched him for a moment. The working hands, the absolute unself-consciousness of a man who had not learned to perform idleness, and she said, "I need to speak with you." He looked up. He saw her face. He set down the wrench and wiped his hands and came to her, and she told him plainly what she had found, and did not dress it in anything except the facts, which were, the letter existed, the handwriting was close. The scheme was one she had not devised, and she had the notes in her boot that would prove it once she found the rest. She finished. He was quiet. His face was doing the thing it did when he was taking a blow without letting it show. "I believe you," he said. She had prepared arguments for why he should. She had not prepared for not needing them. "Why?" she said. "Because the arrangement you are accused of making would have required you to obscure the very discrepancies you came to me to explain. The logic does not survive contact with your actual behavior." He said it plainly, flatly, even, as if belief were not a concession but a conclusion. "Who left the letter?" "I do not yet know with certainty." "You have a suspicion. I have something better than a suspicion. I have arithmetic." She looked at him. "I need 2 more days." He looked at her for a long moment. The stable was very quiet except for the horses. "You have them," he said. She took the 2 days. On the second day, she found the last piece. It was in the household correspondence, which Mrs. Revel kept herself in a box in the small sitting room she had claimed for her use since arriving. Cecily had not looked there. She had looked everywhere else first, because the correspondence box was the obvious place, and she had been a keeper of accounts long enough to know that obvious places were obvious, because people put things in them thinking no one would look, which meant everyone looked, which meant only amateurs used them anymore. Mrs. Revel, it emerged, was an amateur in at least this one respect. She found it on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week she had read her uncle's letter, and she had the thought that Tuesdays were apparently committed to changing her life. In the box, beneath a layer of legitimate household correspondence in Mrs. Revel's neat hand, were 11 letters. 6 were from Mr. Rowe, the late steward, in a tone that was not the tone of a man corresponding with his employer's cousin about household matters. It was the tone of a man corresponding with a person who directed him, who had been directing him, who had told him which invoices to falsify, and at what intervals, and to what account. 1 was from Mr. Henley, the solicitor, asking for instructions about a letter he was to forge. 4 were from a bank in London. The numbers in those letters were very clear. She made copies of all 11 in her cipher. She put the originals back. She put the copies in her boot alongside the others. She smoothed the box, replaced it, and left the room exactly as she had found it. She went to her office and sat for some minutes with her hands flat on the desk, not to steady herself, but because the desk was real and wood-grained and useful, and she required something real and useful under her hands in order to think clearly about the next step. The next step required witnesses. She went to find the Duke and told him that she was ready and that she needed him to send word to Mr. Fairley, the county magistrate, and to Lord Dunmore, who sat on the trust that oversaw the estate's largest holdings, and to his housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, who had been at the park for 30 years, and who had told Cecily, over a cup of strong tea, that she had never much liked Mrs. Revel, and that she would walk through fire for the Duke if he asked her. She wanted them all in the library at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. The Duke looked at her. The thing in his eyes was something she could name now. It was, she thought, the look of a man who had been standing in front of someone and had just registered that they had been standing beside him all along. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. He sent the notes that afternoon. On Wednesday evening, Mrs. Revel came to her in the garden. She came softly, as she did everything, and she sat beside Cecily on the bench that faced the rosemary hedge, and she said in her soft voice that she hoped Cecily had been comfortable at the park, and that the accounts were progressing, and Cecily said they were. Mrs. Revel was quiet for a moment, and her hands, which were usually very still, adjusted the cuff of her sleeve twice, which was the first fidget Cecily had ever seen her make. "I wonder," Mrs. Revel said, "if we might speak plainly." "I prefer it," Cecily said. "You are going to say something to him," Mrs. Revel said. "Tomorrow, about the accounts." "Yes, I want you to know." She stopped. She adjusted her cuff again. When she spoke next, her voice was still soft, but something in it had changed, had become something different from performance, and Cecily heard it and held still. "I want you to know that I was not. It was not malice, not in the beginning." She paused. "He had everything. He has always had everything. The title, the estate, the name. And I had a room in his house by his charity because his wife liked me. And when she died, she stopped again. The hedge was very still. She was my dearest friend," she said, very quietly. "And afterward I had nothing, and I was afraid, and the arithmetic seemed almost fair." Cecily looked at her for a long moment. She heard the thing behind the words, which was real, and the thing it had become, which was not. She thought of her father, who had taught her that everything balanced in the end, and she thought of what you did when the thing that balanced it was not what you had hoped for. "I am sorry," she said, "for the grief. I am not sorry for the arithmetic, because what you are sorry the arithmetic did was take a great deal from people who could not afford it. That is a different kind of fair." Mrs. Revel said nothing. She looked at the garden. After a moment she stood and smoothed her skirt and went inside, and Cecily sat in the evening and listened to a thrush that had been singing from the corner of the garden since her first evening there, and thought about what fare cost and whether it was always the same price. Thursday arrived in the way that deadlines always do, with the same face as the days before it, presenting nothing special to the world, indifferent to the question of what it was about to resolve. Cecily was dressed and at the desk before 7. At 8, she laid out what she intended to lay out, in the order she intended to lay it out, including the hidden pocket in the document case, where she had placed one particular item on the first evening she had been in this room. At 9, she went down to the kitchen and sat with Mrs. Croft and had strong tea and did not mention anything at all, which Mrs. Croft understood and respected, and at 9:45 she carried her document case to the library. Mr. Fairley arrived first, a compact man with a gray moustache and the manner of someone who had sat in judgment on a great many things and found most of them somewhat less dramatic than advertised. Lord Dunmore arrived in a cloud of authority and a good coat. Mrs. Croft placed herself near the door, which was exactly where Cecily had hoped she would place herself. The Duke stood at the window. He was wearing his most still face, which meant he was more alert than he had ever been in this room, and he had placed himself at the window rather than behind the desk, which she had told him to do because standing behind a desk suggested a foregone conclusion, and she wanted this to look like nothing so much as an inquiry, because that was what it was. Mrs. Revel arrived 2 minutes after everyone else, because she had been told the meeting was at 10 past the hour rather than 10. She looked at the room and her face moved through 3 things very quickly: surprise, assessment, and then the smoothing down that was her default, the soft smile, the hands arranged in her lap, the posture of a woman who had simply dropped in. "Mrs. Revel," the Duke said from the window, "please sit." Cecily opened her document case. She began with the accounts, because the accounts were the foundation, and everything else was built on them. She took 20 minutes. She was clear, and she was linear, and she named each false invoice, and the corresponding absence of delivery, and the account to which the funds had traveled. And she showed her work at each step, and by the end of the 20 minutes, Lord Dunmore had gone a color, and Mr. Fairley had his pen out. She did not look at Mrs. Revel. She was not performing for Mrs. Revel. She was building something in the center of the room, methodically, the way you build anything that has to bear weight. Then she took from her document case the letter that had been left on her desk 16 days ago, the one accusing her, in a copy of her own hand, of the very obscuring she had just demonstrated had not occurred. This letter, she said, was placed on my desk on the 16th of August. The hand purports to be mine. It is not mine. She put it on the table. I will demonstrate the difference in a moment. But first I would ask a question. She turned to the door, where a second figure had appeared, Mr. Henley, the solicitor, whom she had invited separately and quietly, and who had arrived as she had arranged. At the moment she had arranged, because she had written to him 3 days ago, not as an accusation, but as a question, and the question she had asked was, who had instructed him to write a letter in the Duke of Ashvale's name, engaging a Miss Vane for account work, and who had subsequently written to him with the forged request, and whether he had kept the correspondence. He had kept it. He was holding it now. Mr. Henley, she said, who sent you these instructions? He was a small man, and he had not been sleeping, she could see that, and when he looked at Mrs. Revel he had the face of a man who had been watching something approach from a long way off, and had finally decided that the cost of stepping aside was lower than the cost of staying put. Mrs. Revel, he said. The letters are here. You may examine the postmarks. The room was very quiet. A bird continued its business in the garden outside, which struck Cecily later as the thing she remembered most clearly. The thrush, unhurried, in the corner, as if the morning had not just turned on its hinge. She put on the table the 11 letters from the correspondence box, the 6 from Mr. Rowe, and the 1 from Henley, and the 4 from the London bank. She put beside them a copy of the forged letter in her hand, and a specimen of her actual handwriting. She put beside those a small ledger, slim, bound in blue leather, that she had found in the hidden pocket of the document case on the first evening she was in this room, which had been put there by the late steward Rowe, and which contained, in Rowe's own hand, a running account of every payment, the date, the amount, and the name of the person who had ordered it. Rowe had kept this because Rowe was a careful man, which was the thing Mrs. Revel had said about him and had meant as a reassurance, not knowing that careful men leave records. Cecily had known. Careful men always leave records. It is the first habit of the careful, and the last one they abandon. She opened the ledger on the table. I will read the first entry, she said, and the last. The entries between may be examined at the court's convenience. She read them aloud. Rowe's hand was clear. The name it contained was not ambiguous. Lord Dunmore set down his pen. He looked at Mrs. Revel. Mrs. Revel was looking at the blue ledger. She had gone very still, not her usual cultivated stillness, but the stillness of a person whose calculations have finally reached their end and arrived at a number they cannot dispute. Then she looked up, and what was on her face was not what Cecily had expected, which was the smooth performance carrying underneath it something else. What was on her face was grief, pure, unornamented grief, the kind that has nothing left to perform for. It lasted a moment, and then she looked at Cecily, and she said, very quietly, she was my dearest friend. Cecily said, I know. She said it without heat, without victory. She said it because it was true, and because the truth of it did not excuse anything, and also did not erase anything, and both of those things were also true, and she was a person who held accounts honestly. The proceedings that followed were conducted by Mr. Fairley, with precision and a minimum of theater. Mrs. Revel made no further statement. The letters and the blue ledger were taken into evidence. The false invoices were detailed. Mr. Henley provided his account in full, which was thorough if not courageous. It was over before noon. The Duke spoke to Mrs. Revel once more before she left, in the small sitting room that had been her domain, and he spoke alone, and Cecily did not hear what he said. What she saw, when Mrs. Revel came out of that room, was a woman who had been given something she had not expected and was still deciding what to do with it. She was escorted to a carriage. The carriage took her to a house in the village of Keswick, which was 2 counties away, and where she had a small income settled on her, not generously, but sufficiently and permanently, by the Duke of Ashvale, whose name was on the instrument, and who had reasoned aloud to Mr. Fairley that the innocent in this situation were herself and the late steward's family, and that any arrangement designed to punish the guilty should not be paid for by them. Mr. Fairley had noted this in his record. Mrs. Croft shut the front door. She turned back to the hall, and her eyes were very bright, which she addressed by becoming extremely busy about the housekeeping of the following 3 minutes. She told Cecily afterward that she had not wept. She had simply had something in her eye, and that it had lasted approximately the time it took to arrange 6 flowers in a vase, and she would thank Cecily not to mention it. The library was empty by early afternoon. The Duke found her in the kitchen garden at her usual hour, though it was earlier than usual because the day had compressed itself into the morning and left the rest open. She was sitting on the bench with her document case at her feet and her hands in her lap, and the thrush was still singing from the corner. She heard him come down the garden path and did not turn, which was not a performance of calm, but actual calm, because she was very tired and very steady, which were things that tended to accompany each other in her experience. He sat beside her, not close, but not far. She could smell the rosemary from the hedge. After a moment he said, "You laid that beautifully." The entry points were already there. Rowe was careful in all directions. I only followed what he left. That is not all you did. She didn't answer immediately. The thrush had gone quiet and then resumed, as thrushes do. "There is a thing I can now say," he said. "Yes, the match between your sister and Dalton was arranged at Mrs. Revell's suggestion. She said it was to help your uncle, whose debts I hold, and I accepted that because I was not attending as carefully as I should have been." He paused. "She had told me your uncle wished it." Your uncle had been told I wished it. No one had asked Harriet or Dalton. When you arrived and said plainly that your sister did not wish it, I believed you immediately, because I had already begun to understand that the channel through which information reached me had been falsified, and because the most efficient way to find out what was actually true was to take the information from the source directly. He looked at the hedge. The match was also an attempt to remove you from the household you worked in and place your attention and your uncle's elsewhere, while the last of the accounts were resolved. Cecily was quiet for a moment. "Then you said you had been looking for a reason to let it go. I had known for 2 months that something was wrong. I needed someone to tell me what." He turned to look at her. "You told me what?" She filed that. She also filed the weight that had been behind it, the thing he had not said, which was that he had been looking for something else also, and had found it the same morning, and had been holding it ever since. She had been holding the same thing. She thought about what he had said in this garden, about the thing you could not yet say, and the question of whether the things balanced, and she thought, "They do." "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Vane." The thrush in the corner sang 4 notes and was quiet. "The material stakes," she said, "are settled." He was very still. "They are." Then she turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the face of a man who has armored himself for a long time against something and has just decided, with full knowledge of what it costs, to put the armor down. His hands were at his sides, quiet, utterly still. She thought of all the evenings in this garden, and all the cups of tea placed at considered distances, and all the words that had been said plainly, and all the ones that had been held in trust, and she thought of her father, who had taught her that everything balanced in the end, and she thought, Here is what it balanced against. Then I believe, she said, that there is something else to say. Yes, he said. There is. He reached into his coat and took out a thing she had not expected. A letter. Small, much folded, the kind of letter that has been taken out and put back many times. He held it out to her. She took it. The handwriting was hers, or rather it was the cipher she had taught her father's patients when they could not read, and which she had mentioned once, in passing, on the second evening in this garden, saying only that her father had invented it, that it was simple, that it was made of flowers. The note said, in her father's flower cipher, she keeps the lamp. She looked up. Where did you dropped it, he said, on the third morning. I found it in the records room. I did not know what it said for some weeks. I found someone to show me the key. A pause, very small. It seems a good description. She thought of what Harriet had said to him, which she was going to have words with Harriet about later, and then she thought of how she was not actually going to have those words, and she said, "You should ask me properly. It is the only kind I will take." He did not smile. He was, she thought, constitutionally incapable of smiling at important moments, and she found she did not mind this at all. He said, "Marry me because you wish to." For no other reason. There is nothing to be paid, nothing owed. I want, he stopped, in the manner of a man who has said a great many careful things and has now arrived at a thing for which care is not the right instrument. I want very much for you to wish to. She looked at him. She thought of the morning she had walked up the gravel drive with her chin level and her hands still, determined to give nothing away, and she thought of every evening since, and the rosemary and the tea and the lamp. You told me, she said, on the second evening, that you had been looking for a reason to let something go. Yes, I have been looking, she said, for a reason to stay. He was very still for one more moment. Then he took her hand, which he had never done, and held it with the care of a man who has been given something he considers extraordinary and means to treat it accordingly, and she felt the scar along the base of his right thumb, and thought about working hands and all the things they revealed about a person, and the thrush in the corner sang, and the rosemary moved in a small breath of wind, and the day, which had held so much, settled into the afternoon with the manner of something well resolved. They were married in October in the church at Thornwick, which held exactly the people they wished to have in it, and none of the people they did not. The ceremony was brief, as Cecily had requested, because she found ceremony in general somewhat redundant when the point had already been established. Harriet cried, which she had said she would not, and Mrs. Croft, standing at the back, had something in her eye again for the duration of 3 hymns, and did not speak of it afterward. Mr. fairly attended and was gratified that the legal proceedings he had conducted 2 months earlier had resolved so neatly into a social occasion of this nature. Lord Dunmore sent a handsome gift and a note that was warmer than his public manner would have suggested. Mr. Henley did not attend, which was appropriate and agreed upon. Mr. Dalton, who had by this point exchanged several more letters with Harriet, attended as her guest, and they were observed walking in the garden after the breakfast, with the particular careful attention of 2 people who are not certain what the other is thinking, and are finding this condition pleasanter than expected. Cecily said nothing about this. The ledger of some things was best left open. Mrs. Revel was not present. She had written once, briefly, to the Duke, in a letter that said nothing that required answering, and he had answered it anyway, 2 lines, and the correspondence had ended there. In Keswick, by all accounts, she kept a small garden, and had found, in the neighboring village, a woman she described as a good friend. Cecily thought of that, and of what things cost and what they were worth, and thought, some reckonings are not ours to hold forever. Her uncle settled his debts, which were no longer held against him in any meaningful sense, over the following year, because the Duke's agent had quietly restructured the terms in a way that left her uncle's dignity intact, which was more than he deserved and exactly what was required. Her uncle thanked Cecily for this at Christmas, as if she had arranged it, and she accepted his thanks without correcting him, because some credits were properly hers, even if the hand on the instrument had been another's. Her father's small practice she refounded in the spring, not as a practice, but as a lending library of accounts, a place where anyone who needed their books put in order could bring them and have it done without fee and without judgment. This was the thing the epilogue repaired, and it was the thing she had been thinking about since the second evening in the kitchen garden, when she had told him that her father had left the practice and no money to run it, and he had asked her nothing further and had filed the answer. A year and 2 weeks after the Thursday in the library, she was walking in the kitchen garden at her usual hour when she heard his step on the path, which she recognized by now with the accuracy of a woman who has listened to it across all 4 seasons, and she did not turn, and he sat beside her on the bench. And the thrush, which had never left, she was almost certain it was the same bird, sang from its corner. The rosemary hedge was very green in the thin September light. His hands were at his sides, the right one turned slightly, and she reached over, without looking, and set her hand on his, and felt the old scar under her thumb, and the morning was very quiet, and everything was, to her professional satisfaction, in balance. She keeps the lamp. That was what the cipher had said. She had written it in her father's shorthand for a patient whose name she no longer remembered, and she had lost it on the 3rd morning in the records room, and it had been given back to her in the garden with the meaning changed, not in its words, but in what stood behind them. That was the way of refrains. You said a thing and put it down, and someone else picked it up and handed it back, and it was the same line and an entirely different one, and both things were true simultaneously, which was the sort of arithmetic she had always found the most interesting. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the one who kept the lamp burning in a room where no one thought to look, and held your ground quietly, and found that the truth simply needed someone willing to follow it all the way to the end, then you know what was in that garden, and I am glad you stayed by the fire to hear it. There is always a chair kept here, and the kettle does not go cold between stories. Tell me in the comments the moment that stayed with you longest. The blue ledger, perhaps, or the scar on his thumb, or the line she would not let him take back. Stay close to the hearth if this is the kind of story that keeps you, and may every lamp you tend find someone, in time, who reads what it says. Sleep well, and keep your accounts honestly, and be gentle with the ones who kept your lamp lit.